On this episode of the Futures in Digital Learning podcast, we bring you a conversation with fellow instructional designers Lindsay Lutman and Ben Pawlowski about the importance of play.
The opposite of play is not work, it's depression. Like, play is a biological need.
I think a big element in play is not necessarily having an expected outcome.
Join us as we discuss how play can inform our roles as IDs and how we can change the perception of play. Hello and welcome to this next episode. This is episode 5 of season 3 of the Futures in Digital Learning podcast. Welcome again. My name is Adam Davi, instructional design manager at UCAT, and I'm here as always with Brian Hale. Howdy, Brian.
Hey, welcome back, everybody.
And today we are joined by two of our fellow instructional designers here at UCAT, Lindsay Lutman and Ben Pawlowski. Thank you very much for joining us, both of you.
Happy to be here.
Having us.
Awesome. And they are here to talk today because they ran a little internal book club on the topic of play. And I will let you all introduce kind of the book you talked about and what inspired you to explore this idea and how you did it. So with that said, please go ahead and jump on in and tell us a little bit about this venture that you embarked on.
Sure. I can start since I was the one that initiated the idea and was so happy to have others join in. So in February, there was this great, we'll call it a unconference that was sponsored by ASU and professors at Play called the Playposium. And so this was February 2024. They had this great keynote speaker. His name was Dr. Stuart Brown. And he talked about his book and his research in play. And so his book is called Play, How It Shapes the Brain, Opens the Imagination, and Invigorates the Soul. And I thought that it was a great way to start a conversation about how do we sort of increase the use of play in our work, in higher education, in order to sort of increase excitement, wellness, success amongst faculty, students, and ourselves as instructional designers.
And yeah, I guess I got very interested in the topic just from my history as an educator. I'm a little new to the world of instructional design, but I've taught K to 12 for a little over 10 years. And any times when I could engage the students in any kind of version of play, I just really saw a lot of great benefits to it. I was an art teacher mostly, and sometimes students would really like freeze up when an assignment was like really big and they'd get like too intimidated by, I don't know, their skills or their own confidence in it. But often when I saw them like really loosen up, or just like I did a lot of like warm-up drawings with students, and I always had like pretty ridiculous prompts like design a box for a disgusting cereal or something, things like that. That's where I would really see students open up, because it was very like low stakes. I just basically graded them like, did you do it? Great, you get credit. That was often like my favorite thing to grade. Sometimes the bigger assignments were a bit more of a slog, but where they could be more playful.
Yeah.
That's so fun. So as soon as Lindsay had this idea for the book club, I wanted to sign up immediately.
Very cool. That sounds like a lot of fun to do those type of activities, and I'm glad you both explored this idea of play, because I also think it's important, and I've done some research and creativity studies in the past and things like that, which I think kind of ties in a little bit. But what did you find are like the benefits for both students and instructors of engaging in play?
I guess I could go first this time. Yeah, you really see it's like just a different way of getting to know somebody when you can kind of take things from a different angle. Or I think a big element in play is not necessarily having an expected outcome. So I think people really loosen up when they feel like that's where they're at when they're in that state of play. You get in a state of flow. You kind of like you don't worry about time as much, and you're just kind of a little bit more in the moment. And I think oftentimes more yourself. And I think that's wonderful to see in your students, and it's wonderful to feel yourself when you're teaching. So that's kind of always something I was seeking out.
And I think that there's this element of sort of safety that comes with play. So when you're in a space where you feel unsafe, whether that's like a creative unsafety, I don't feel, creative or like my ideas are worth something, and you start to get into your head, I think that's really where play comes into play. um, and where I think it's beneficial both for students and learners as they're learning a new field, and then also for instructors and for IDs as we're trying to create these new spaces to engage.
Awesome. I was just kind of thinking of this story. I have a 3-year-old at home whose imagination is, runs wild, right? And the other day he was pretending to drive in a car, and he wanted the radio on. I'm doing air quotes there for those listening. And I thought, oh, the radio. We have an Alexa. We can just have her play music, right? And that'll be the radio. And he said, no, the pretend radio, Dad. I said, oh, okay. So even just like in his play world, he was just like everything is just imaginary, and he was like super into it, and like I'm gonna turn these imaginary buttons and turn the radio on. I just thought of that as like, well, that's like cool. Like how can we, you know, bring that level of imagination and play into our world? So I'm excited to there's another reason I was excited to have this conversation, because I think it's fun to give people like that free reign, right? And like what might they come up with, right? Like the imagination of a 3-year-old is limitless. And we lose some of that as we get older, but how can we get that back a little bit?
It makes me think one thing that came up in our conversations a lot was there's this play which is an act. So like your son playing with objects, but then there's also this idea of play as a mindset
Mhm.
of just like you exploring the world through your
Yeah.
son's perception and
Mhm.
thinking about those connections. And I think
Yeah.
that both of those are super important as we move into kind of the creative space of course design.
Yeah, and I think
That's
a lot of times it can start in just like a simple place, like when we're having these conversations with instructors, and I think it can be too easy for both sides to kind of like freeze up and try to be
Mhm.
super professional, and not that like play can be very serious, of course, but like just even getting them into to engage a little bit in even the littlest bit of role play of like what would you feel like as a student in this course, like imagine that for a
Yeah.
second. That's a little bit of play, and I think that's another thing we tried to talk about a lot too is yes, there is this like goal of more play that we're trying to bring into the world of ID, but I think it's also good to recognize I think we're all doing it at least a little bit, and it's important to kind of celebrate those victories and what we can do with it. Like I know early on, I stole a play from Reese Davis's playbook because she would tell me when she would. Yeah, I'm sure lots of us
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
stolen ideas
It's
from
fair.
Reese. So thank you, Reese. But just trying to have this conversation with them, like if time wasn't an issue, if money wasn't an issue, what would you like this course to be like? And yeah, just that little bit of imagination can get the ball rolling a little bit and hopefully get you to a place you want to be.
And I always ask the question too, sometimes, or at least in my head, like, if I were a student, would I be excited to do this assignment? Right? Like, is this something I want to do? And like you said, like, you know, earlier, the assignments you like grading the most were the low stakes, fun, creative ones, right? And so, well, how can we get that excitement into some of the higher stakes assignments too, and build that level of creativity and play and fun? And maybe it's not always possible, like English majors still have to write essays and read Shakespeare, and not that that's not fun, but what can we do with it to
So
build
at
it
this
up?
point, I have to ask a question, and I want to preface it so that we don't get angry letters. I love the idea of play in course design and course work. Because who wants to take a dull, boring course? Nobody. But why do we, as educators, or maybe as a system, put so much value into what we think is a high stakes, and we put less value into the low stakes, where low stakes seem to spark much more creativity and much more engagement, and high stakes, what does that spark? Stress, anxiety,
Yeah.
upset. How do we kind of make or transition what we think of as a high stakes assignment or activity? How do we translate that into a low stakes activity where the student is still learning something, enjoying what it is they're learning, and then they take that learning that they've enjoyed and then they pass it on to somebody else? As opposed to somebody goes, "Oh, I just took FPID 409 and that was the most horrible course I've ever, I wouldn't wish that course on my worst enemy." How do we get to that point?
Well, I don't think it's yeah, it's not an easy thing. And I think one of the obstacles we talked about a lot in our conversations is, there's a certain expectation that a lot of people have that college courses are supposed to be grueling, or they're supposed to be difficult, or they're supposed to be like adult and all serious and everything. And that's certainly a battle that it isn't going to go away anytime soon. But I think a lot about, like, I think one of the obstacles is we're expected to grade so much of what's in a course, and it's hard to have a state of play when a grade is at stake. Because again, like the state of play is supposed to kind of like be a little bit looser. It's not supposed to have super specific outcomes. It's supposed to just kind of be this space where ideas can go in so many different directions. So I don't know, like one idea I've been exploring a lot, and I'm certainly not an expert on this at all yet either, but the idea of having like a grading contract where rather than this expectation of this finished result has to like meet all these criteria, it's more like what are the activities you're doing along the way, and there's a little bit more room for play and maybe like a revision or a reflection or even just in editing where I don't know, you can take maybe those bigger assignments that can be so scary and break them down into some more playful pieces. I know that's like super abstract and probably not a formula that anybody can run away with, but I hope that can like maybe spark some things for myself. I have to remind myself of these things too.
Yeah, I think something that's also come up over and over again as I've gotten deeper into the idea of play is that in society, we see the opposite of play as being work. So that idea of you can't go out and play until you finish your homework, or you can't go out and do something fun until you finish that essay this weekend that's due on Monday. And what has been stated is that in a lot of the books is the opposite of play is not work, it's depression. Like play is a biological need. And we find play in a lot of different spaces, both as children and adults. But as adults, we've become conditioned, right, to view play as this
It's a bad
luxury
word.
thing. Yeah, bad word, exactly. So I think that reframing how we view play and what that means in our life is an important step in that process.
I like that kind of breaking up of that dichotomy of play versus work. It's not all or nothing, right? We're not Sith versus Jedi, you know, in that sense where we can those things can coexist and be one or the other. And one of the things you brought up, Ben, which I think is important, is the outcomes, right? And I think this ties into Brian's question, right? Like how are we structuring the outcomes where we can do these playful things and still meet the outcomes, right? It's not like, oh, you have to do this grueling and rigorous assignment to meet the outcome, but you can make a video, right? You can write a movie script, you can sing a song, you can build a version of Mars out of Legos. Like, right, these type of things that And as you can tell from my ramblings, these are things that I want to be able to do in my personal life and maybe don't. But yeah, I think that's important is if we're tied into the outcomes, then we can still build these things in a little bit.
You make a really great point about Legos. So you and I having young children, I
Yeah.
got a Lego set, a new Lego set.
Mhm.
It was I don't remember what it was, but it was made in the last couple of years. And the looking through the instruction book on how to put this thing together, there was no obvious way to put this Lego set together. When I was a kid, you could look at the box and spill all the Legos out and put together that thing without the instruction manual. Now you need an instruction manual to play. What? Oh, no. Why? It's called play. I should be able to like look at a picture and put together the Legos. I don't want to have to read War and Peace to put together a set of Legos. It should be intuitive and it should be like, yeah, I may need help figuring out a certain structure so the thing doesn't fall apart when it's standing upright. But like you needed to put certain random Legos in to build this structure that weren't there in the sets that were available when I was a kid. And I just thought, I'm wondering if that makes play, air quotes, more difficult. So in thinking about play, how do you make sure that your play is not more difficult than it needs to be? Like, making sure the content of your course is appropriate to the level of the course. You're not teaching a 500 level course to a 101 level class.
It's an interesting analogy that you've got there because I feel like, yeah, the instruction book approach to making a Lego creation is maybe where some of our instructors are at now, or they have it very confined to like a very specific outcome that they want. And that's not all bad. I think there are people that could go through that process of building something with Legos and find it relaxing and just like, oh, look, I didn't have to think too hard. They laid it all out for me, and I have this Death Star at the end of it. But maybe a more playful approach to it is like, think about, well, maybe your outcome is just like to have a spaceship and you provide pieces, and a more playful approach would just be like, yeah, just make a spaceship. That's all the directions that some people might need. So I don't know. I'm not really answering your question very well. I just got caught up on that analogy.
No, but you're thinking about it, which is great. You're thinking of ways to like
Yeah.
how to do this kind of stuff.
I'm going to build on Ben and your spaceship analogy because I used this recently with an instructor where we were talking about their wonderful project for the semester. It was very regimented. And so then the next step to thinking about the playfulness was, well, what dials in your spaceship, we'll say, would you be willing to hand over to your students to play with? So think about what are those variables that you would be okay with them changing, and they would still be able to meet the outcomes of the course. And then which of those dials are like the red ones that require the like lock to activate, that they would have to come to you to be like, hey, can I do this? And you can then key the lock to open that dial. And then which are like the red buttons no one touches unless you're aborting the mission. And so thinking about that could potentially help move from a very structured space with your Lego book to something that's a little bit more playful, and that student choice, being able for them to define what's going to be playful for them, because some people might really love working from a Lego book that's 100 pages long.
And that's what I was going to say is some people need that structured version of play. And I was going to, equate it to cooking as well, right? Like I love to cook, but I can't just see ingredients and put things together and make something. I need a recipe. But I still like following the recipe and cooking and seeing that come to fruition is still enjoyable for me.
And then you can add your own stuff later to that, right?
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So and then I can tinker with it. I can play kind of like what Lindsay was saying, like what are things that I can swap in and out? What are things that like must be in there? But that idea of the structure for some people, I think is helpful. You can still find that engagement and enjoyment and play a little with that.
Yeah, I know like one thing I used to try to build into assignments when I was a K to 12 teacher, and I haven't really quite made that bridge into instructional design yet, but maybe this is the conversation I need to remind me about it.
Yes.
But I would often break down assignments to try to give kids as many options as I possibly can. There's a mandatory part of this assignment. It needs to be this size, you need to use this materials, blah blah blah. There's the encourage. These are the things you probably should do unless you have a really good reason or feel really strongly not to do. These are the things that you probably should do. And then there was like completely optional. Here's some like random ideas. Here's some things you can try. Put it in there if that makes sense to you. But it only if like you really feel good about it or that's like what you want to do. Now, it's not an easy way to build an assignment necessarily in a lot of courses. If there can be something built that way, I think like I think there's a lot of in this play space that we want to get to that comes with like giving students autonomy as much as we can, giving them options in what they're doing, and then we're coming a little bit closer to play and them a little bit feeling more comfortable, a little bit more feeling like themselves in this course and probably having a more memorable experience.
So this, brings me to kind of another concept, right? This idea of play and autonomy and everything. And we're touching on kind of themes of gamification as well. And so how is this idea of play distinguished from gamification? Or is it? Are they mixed? Are they, what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's definitely significant overlap. I don't know. I tend to think of a lot of things on a spectrum, I guess. And yeah, maybe the purest form of play probably isn't exactly overlapping with gamification because when I think of gamification, I still think there's still like a goal or there might be points or there's a way to
Okay.
win or there's at least a way to feel like successful, I guess. And like the purest form of play doesn't necessarily have that, but maybe gamification is like a way to kind of bridge that gap a bit where you can have there's still like maybe a playful element that you're trying to get them to. You use some motivating factors to nudge them along a little bit. And that being said, like there certainly are examples of games and gamified ideas that might not have points or might not have a winner
Hmm.
or a real specific goal. I think a lot of like I'm going to go and talk about video games here a little bit, but games that were like really popular during like the quarantine, like Animal Crossing and Stardew Valley, where there's not an end point necessarily. There's maybe ways you can feel successful within it. So I don't know. I'm rambling here a little bit, but there's
No.
there's there's some parallels. But yeah, I guess mostly I think of gamification as kind of like how can we carry somebody along that's being resistant to just letting loose and playing.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree. The gamification is like a framework that we can
Mhm.
use to arrive at this playfulness. So Dr. Stuart Brown identified 8 different types of play personalities, which
Oh.
has really helped me in thinking about this choice in assignments and then also how gamification relates to play. So the 8 personality types, the joker, the kinesthete, the explorer, competitor, director, collector, artist or creator, and then the storyteller. And when I think about a game, depending on what game you're playing,
Yeah.
that game can incorporate those elements that those different play personalities are going to
Hmm.
gravitate to. So the points aspect, competitor is going to be really keyed into that aspect. If your game involves movement, like moving from space to space or doing something physical, your kinesthete is really going to
Hmm.
gravitate towards that. If it has a story associated with it, like D&D or something, around
Yeah.
the role playing, you're going to have the storyteller, the director. So I think that gamification gives a lot of opportunities to bring in those things that people will gravitate to as play.
Well, now I'm really fascinated. We're gonna take this in a little bit of a different direction with these play personalities. And so I have worked with some other IDs in the field, and this isn't something that we do a whole lot that I'm aware of at UCAT, but this idea of using student personas to develop courses and and what that looks like as far as giving kind of building out what a student profile might look like with this persona and building the course, like how would this student interact and engage and whatnot. So has there been any thought, or have you had any thought of using these play personalities to build student personas or create this idea of like what might this look like with all these different types of personalities in a course, and how might these assignments uh, work with each one? And you sort of started to talk about this, but like from a design perspective, I find that very fascinating.
It's definitely something that I'm starting to explore,
Okay.
the use
Okay.
of student personas
Okay.
and how do we scope a project and work with faculty to position the student within the design of a course. So they are the center. And so I think bringing in these play personalities would be
Hmm.
a huge part of
Yeah.
moving more intentionally towards a playful space, but also needing to acknowledge what the instructor's play personality is, or what
Yeah.
my play personality is, and what I tend to gravitate toward. So I will say I'm definitely the storyteller, explorer, collector. I like to
Okay.
collect information, ideas, and so that's where I tend to gravitate towards. And it would
Okay.
be interesting to start asking questions of faculty. What are their play
Yeah.
personalities? What do they gravitate toward?
I think it would be interesting to like figure that out for our ID team as well and see like what our play personalities are and how can we develop activities within our team to for our professional and personal growth as well, that touch on some of these. I think that would be fascinating. So we might have maybe we have to have a conversation later about that, Lindsay, off the podcast about how we can determine everybody's play personality
Yeah, that would
and go
be
from there.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is this thing, I'll just say that it's called a play history. And so I did one very informally to
Okay.
identify what do I tend to gravitate towards based off of what I did when I was younger, what brings me
Okay.
joy. And then that helped me identify kind of my strongest play personality.
Hmm.
So just as we're not a specific type of
Right.
learner, right? We're not a
Right.
specific play personality. It depends on our environment.
Hmm.
So I would definitely encourage everyone to kind of just take some time to reflect on what did you do when you were younger that like brought you joy, and how are you
Yeah.
doing that now, in order to bring yourself some stress relief, and to
Yeah.
kind of take breaks within your work environment.
So that
Yeah,
your suggestion about stress relief and taking breaks kind of sparked something in my mind about, and Ben, when you were talking about video games, when I was in elementary school, one of the video games that was available to us was Oregon Trail. Now, there's been several versions of Oregon Trail since it originally came out, but the original one, I remember my homesteading team always died within 3 rounds of dysentery. And that usually left me very, very frustrated. And I got to the point where I didn't want to play that game anymore because I knew I was going to die before completing like even 10% of that game. So, what happens? What are some ideas when you want to add play to your course that you may have students who, they don't know what they don't know yet. And so you're trying to incorporate play, but they're getting frustrated because they don't know how to play, or they don't know how to play this thing that you're giving them. How can we address that in course design? Could we do that through like open office hours or Zoom meetings or ask the class discussion boards? How do we help eliminate frustration from play?
Yeah, again, a tough question, and I'm not going to be able to easily solve it or anything. But yeah, I think it's just yeah, trying to think like, well, what do you want to happen when a student quote unquote fails or doesn't meet the objective? Like, do they just have to start over? Yeah, I could see something like I remember being frustrated by Oregon Trail too. I'm like, on one hand, it was like, oh, I get to play video games at school, but then it's like, oh, but I'm actually like okay at most of school and I'm failing at this constantly. It's
Video
not a good
game.
feeling. So yeah, so maybe you want them to fail and then reflect on that failure, or at least have a conversation with other students about like what happened, or they might tap into some kind of a resource that helps them maybe like analyze it, like what happened that made you not reach whatever goal either you were trying to get them to reach or they themselves are trying to get them to reach. And it did make me think like, as much as sometimes I think there's a big obstacle in getting an instructor to embrace play and a little bit maybe even silliness in a course. There's that same obstacle with students who might think, I'm in college now and the teacher wants me to play. What a waste of time. And they might brush
Yep.
it off and be like, I this course is ridiculous. It's a waste of my time. So it's a fine line. I mean, I don't know. I guess part of it is relationship building and trying to just get that student buy-in into like to take a risk and like, yeah, you might fail at this, but like we fail at things all the time in life, and that's kind of a reality, and that's how we learn. It's tough because like there is just this, I don't know, societal expectation of like I need to take this course and I pass this course and then I get a job and then blah 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 blah. But like, but how do you actually like? Do you care about just the grade you're getting in that course, or do you actually care about learning and reflecting on something? And it's a tough hill to get up.
I mentioned this earlier, this idea of flow. And I don't know how much any of you all or our listeners have studied flow theory, but it's something I've always been fascinated on. And this idea of being in flow where the challenge of the activity is aligned with the skill level that you are bringing into that activity. And I think that's with the Oregon Trail analogy you brought up, Brian, right? Maybe the challenge of that activity was too high, so kids couldn't get into that flow, that sense of flow with it, right? And same thing when you're designing courses and designing activities with those courses. If you want the students to get into flow and get into that level, you have to, create that balance, right? Of where are the students' skills and what is the challenge of that activity, and are they aligned, and are they otherwise students are going to feel frustrated when the challenge is too high and their skills don't match, or they're going to feel bored if the challenge is too low and their skills are too high, right? So it's finding that balance, which is tricky. And then, kind of like what you were saying, right, Ben? Like, oh, are students going to be like, well, this doesn't feel like college. But if you get that right level, that right mix, then they're going to want to keep going because they are in flow and they're building that, whether it's playful or whether they know it's playful or not, even, right? They're going to want to keep going. And I think that for us as designers is the challenge, right? And we get into that series of flow, right? Where we're finding that challenge that matches with our skills and can create that perfect mix of course design.
And if you're into QM, we call it alignment.
Yeah. Speaking of play, there's QM. No, just kidding.
Hey, I have fun
But
checking off those little boxes, okay?
it is fun. I guess, we've sort of talked about this and but I want to kind of come back to it. How can we make our work environment more playful? And how can we use play to build relationships, especially, where for us we're kind of hybrid, right? Where we have, a lot of people working remotely. Some people come in, we see some people in person from time to time, but we're primarily remote. Like, how do we build that in to give us some sense of playfulness in what we do?
Go ahead, Lindsay. That's a tough one. It's a tough one.
It is a tough one, and I feel like, I guess, standing on the shoulders of giants. There's this wonderful person, Gary Ware, who wrote this great book called The Playful Rebellion, which talks a lot about, work and play from a corporate perspective, but I think it flows right into what we do in higher education. And so he argues that it's not about the big things, but the small opportunities that you take. So things like, how do you power up and power down after a task? Before you start a task, do you listen to music? Do you get up and dance? Do you go for a walk? I'm getting into a lot of the kinesthetic things, lots of physical activity, but also how do we celebrate our wins and reframe our failures? And that, I think, goes back to the student side as well, how we reframe the student failures. So I think it's just individually, how are we taking moments for ourselves to connect with our playfulness? And then how are managers making it possible for us to do that? And one of the things we talked about, Ben, I think you mentioned this really resonated with you as well, that daydreaming is a form of playing, giving yourself space to just kind of be and explore and kind of think about the possibilities as a way to play. And how can managers and workspaces allow that to happen?
I mean, as a manager, I fully encourage daydreaming. I do plenty of it myself. So, um, yeah.
I remember being just super comforted by that because I've been like a daydreaming person like for as long back as I can remember. I even remember like early like third or fourth grade, one of my teachers being like, Ben does okay, but oftentimes I look at him and he seems like he's in a different place. And that's probably often accurate. I was maybe a little bit bored, so my brain was taking me someplace more interesting.
Yeah.
And I think I always was like self-conscious about that. So it would be like, oh, okay, it's not all bad. I mean, there's times I should have been paying attention a little bit more closely, but it's not something to completely try to eradicate out of your behavior.
Yeah. I had a teacher tell me something similar once back in high school. She said, when I look at you in class, you look like you're lost, but then you do well on all the tests. So I haven't said anything to you. And I'm like, oh, I don't know. I guess I'm absorbing it. But yeah, I think that's speaking from the manager's perspective. I think we are trying to build spaces where you have the freedom to explore some of these passion areas that maybe you're interested in, that you do daydream about, right? And maybe want to get into. I think that was part of you all having this book club, right? It's something, Lindsay, that you brought to us and said, I'd like to do this, and we want to give you those opportunities to explore those different things and concepts and ideas and whatnot. So, if there's ever things that come up that you want to explore more, please let us know. And for anybody listening, if you're a manager or if you're not, like, we as managers can't read minds. And so, hopefully you're in a space where you can have those kind of open conversations and talk about that. And then as a manager, like, same thing, we can't read, we don't know what's going on unless you tell us. But we can also be proactive in saying, like, hey, what could make this a little bit more enjoyable and engaging as a team? And so, we try to do things as much as we can. And we're always open to suggestions as well, though. So
Yeah,
we'll throw that out there.
well, I think this podcast is definitely like brushing up on
Yeah.
a lot of kinds of play where, I'm an instructional designer. Am I doing instructional design right now? Not exactly, but
Yeah.
it's letting us explore some of these ideas in a way that yeah, we don't have a specific outcome in mind from this conversation, but I can already say like there are things that came up in this like, oh yeah, those are like good reminders or new ideas that I can bring into what I'll be doing this afternoon. That's maybe a little bit more specifically instructional design.
Yeah. Yeah. And this was honestly something too that I just like had this idea like, hey, we should have an instructional design focused podcast. Can I do it? And they were like, sure, go for it. So it's for me, and I think I can speak for Brian as well, it's one of the most fun parts of our job that we get to do on a semi-regular basis.
So tell us the name of the author and the book
Yeah.
again, so folks don't have to rewind.
Sure. So it's going to be Gary Ware, Ware. And then the book is Playful Rebellion, and then Maximize Workplace Success Through the Power of Play. It's a very quick, great read. And he also has a website, so check out his website if you don't have time to read a book.
And what's next on the book club agenda? Is there another book coming
Oh,
up?
there's so many options. I don't know. We'll have to do some exploration,
Oh,
engage our explorer side and collect some ideas.
I have another book on play that I actually bought like 5, 6 years ago that I never fully finished, and that's why I wanted to sign up for this book club. Was like, oh, that'll pressure me into finishing it. So maybe I'll read that and then see if that's maybe a worthwhile book to introduce into the conversation. So stay tuned, I guess.
Nice. Okay.
awesome. Well, when, whatever comes next, we're happy to have you back to come talk about it and see how that can help inform our work as instructional designers and also, maybe some of our work as Lego builders and chefs in the kitchen. Awesome. Well, thank you both again for joining us on the podcast. This was delightful. Always happy to talk to all of you, and I'm glad we get to do it in such a fun and casual environment as well. So thank you. Look forward to chatting again. And for those of you listening, thank you for listening, and keep on listening. We'll have another episode coming up soon. Thank you.